Siraya is an unusual case in Taiwan because it was quite well documented during the Dutch colonial period in the 17th century. However, by the 19th century, it had more or less become extinct because of assimilation with the Han Chinese culture. So in order to revitalize it, I found the Gospel of St. John lying in a library in Copenhagen, and that has significantly increased the amount of data.
What we speak in St. Vincent, the Grenadines, is what I would say is fluid. And this is what I think poses some difficulty with regard to giving it a certain, box to say this is Vincentian Creole.
We've introduced Creole speaking into our elementary school, but it's not where the written aspect that is emphasized at that young age. It is the oral traditions.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. There are around 7,000 languages spoken around the world, but nearly half are at risk of becoming endangered or are disappearing as we speak. A number of those languages are in Taiwan, but there are efforts being made to revive some of those, and linguists are now documenting little-known languages that evolved throughout Taiwan's colonial past. Now, to understand the importance of revitalizing different tongues and the complexities of Taiwan's languages, we are joined by Christopher Joby, a professor at the Center of Taiwan Studies at SOAS University of London. And his latest book is titled Christian Mission in 17th Century Taiwan. Great to have you on the program. I want to start with what many are regarding as a success story, and that's the Siraya language. Can you give us a little bit of background on that language and who speaks it?
Okay, so Siraya is an unusual case in Taiwan because it was quite well documented during the Dutch colonial period in the 17th century. However, by the 19th century, it had more or less become extinct because of assimilation with the Han Chinese culture. But in the late 20th century, efforts began to revitalize Siraya. And they are going well, but they face a number of challenges that I'm sure we'll discuss during the program.
Indeed. Now, your discovery of the Siraya Dutch Gospel of St. John has been called a Rosetta Stone by linguists. Can you explain?
Yeah, so as I said, because it became extinct, no one was speaking Siraya during the 20th century. And so in order to revitalize it, language activists have been using the text written by the Dutch with the help of Siraya informants in the 17th century. Up till my discovery in 2019, they had two principal texts. One was a catechism and the other was the Gospel of St. Matthew. I found the Gospel of St. John lying in a library in Copenhagen, and that has significantly increased the amount of data, if you like, on which the language revivalists can draw as they reconstruct and revive the language.
Is there any way of quantifying or qualifying what a revival of a language is?
That is a very good question. I think you have to look at what is a successful revival, and if we take the case of Siraya, that's, if you like, work in progress. The key thing, as I see it, and there's been a lot of research done on Gaelic Irish, for example, is that it's spoken in the home, because that kind of brings a new generation of speakers into play. And at the moment, Siraya is not spoken that widely in the home. It's mainly based in schools at the moment. So it's work in progress, and if you like, the jury is still out on whether that will succeed in time and become a fully functioning language within Siraya communities.
Now, Taiwan has a very complicated past with different groups coming in, administering Taiwan or colonizing Taiwan. And given that, do you have a sense, as someone who has been a scholar here, of how many other languages there are out there, or how much more there is to uncover here in Taiwan?
That's a very good question. As you'll know, Mandarin and to a lesser extent English are what we might call the languages of wider communication, used by people to communicate with other people who don't share the same first language, for example. Then you've got the other Sinitic languages such as Hakka and Hokkien, and then you've got a whole range of the indigenous languages, which are in various states of decline or being revitalized. And then, of course, you've got other languages from migrant workers, such as Filipino, Tagalog, and Indonesian. So it's a very interesting situation for linguists such as myself, but also a very complicated one to negotiate in everyday life. I think it's fair to say that Mandarin is the dominant language. The language of wider communication, but there are many other languages in what you might call a sea of languages.
Right, and speaking of seas of languages, we're going to go beyond Taiwan and take a look at how some other countries or even islands are trying to contain their linguistic sphere. Now, languages are constantly evolving with new phrases and words incorporated mostly through migration and diverse communities. In the past, many languages emerged from the weight of colonization on a population, which resulted in Caribbean countries having their own Creole languages. Now, Creole is defined as the mixing of different languages, typically in situations where speakers of various native tongues interact. There are 29 countries in the Caribbean that have at least one Creole language, but many of them are under threat of dying out. Now, Robert Kennedy Lewis is the former education minister of St. Lucia and currently an ambassador in Taiwan, and he explains how the Caribbean nation is revitalizing their language.
If you do not teach the younger generation a language, if they don't practice it at home, you will lose the language. So the government has begun encouraging Creole speaking, and we've introduced Creole speaking into our elementary school. So from kindergarten, we begin now to have conversations in Creole. Of course, while it is written, but it's not where the written aspect that is emphasized at that young age. It is the oral traditions. So that's one way the government does it. Another way the government will do it is by encouraging government programs in Creole to disseminate information to the people. But there could be about 5% of St. Lucians who still depend on Creole entirely, who will have problems understanding if you're trying to discuss an issue with them in English. So the government realized that they have to disseminate information to these persons, but they have to do it through Creole news, through Creole information. And even in the parliament, if you go to the St. Lucian Parliament or you listen to the St. Lucian Parliament, you will see the moderators, one person speaking English, one person speaking Creole. So people who are following at home, they can tell them what exactly is happening.
Now, Taiwan has its own Creole, which we'll be looking at and listening to later in the program. But before we go to that, Mandarin, of course, as you had also mentioned, dominates Taiwan today. How do you think that's impacted trying to revive other languages in Taiwan, like Siraya?
Positive and negative, I would say. On the one hand, clearly, it is a dominant language. And it's actually fairly recent that it's become a dominant language. That's mainly through the KMT policies post-Second World War. And that dominance means, obviously, that, parents, when they're deciding what language they're going to talk to their children in or what they're going to encourage them to do at school, they will tend towards Mandarin and also English, as opposed to the indigenous languages. On the other hand, having Mandarin as a dominant language, it can be used as a language of instruction, and often is. And that's the way that children can be taught Siraya. And interestingly, in the schools where Siraya is taught, it's not just indigenous Siraya children who are learning Siraya, but also Han Chinese children as well. Now, whether they use it outside the school, that's another question. but certainly, Mandarin is used as the language of instruction in that regard.
Now, Taiwan's government has made a concerted effort, particularly recently, in trying to instill more of the languages that different communities speak and try and put them more into the mainstream. Do you think this is something, trying to get people to speak languages, how essential is it, especially with the younger generation, for it to be a concerted government effort?
Certainly, if a government backs a language, that gives it status. Often money comes along with that official backing, and that's useful in terms of developing resources for language learning. And also things like, dual language signs, bringing the language into the public space. In terms of Siraya, up till now, it's had official backing at a local level by Tainan City Council, but hasn't been officially recognised at a national level. That's probably in the process of changing due to a decision by the Constitutional Court in 2022. But again, that's all going to take time to filter through in terms of money and resources and status. A language has to have status for people to want to learn it. So there's, it's a complicated picture. I think that's fair to say.
All right. So on that note, let's take a look at another Caribbean country and how its Vincentian Creole is widely spoken, despite English being the official language. Andrea Bowman is the country's ambassador in Taiwan and an educationist. She explained why it's a challenge to standardize the country's English-based Creole.
What we speak in St. Vincent, the Grenadines, is what I would say is fluid. It's fluid. And this is what I think poses some difficulty with regard to giving it a certain, box to say this is Vincentian Creole, right? There is no established form throughout the country, and our country is 32 islands and keys. So I would say we have a fluid vernacular, okay, which is close and further away from standard English. We recognize why we speak, the way we speak, we understand what it says about our cultural heritage and our cultural evolution, but in terms of an official policy to try to protect it in any way and what's not, I am not aware that we have that type of initiative. Okay? But of course, just to go on a little further, for example, in school, in secondary school, and I would make lots of references to secondary school or school because I am a teacher. When you teach, for example, short story, you encourage the writers, we encourage our students when they are writing about dialogue between characters, use the language which would be most representative and most realistic for the characters. And that language that would be most representative of the characters is not standard English. It would be the Creole English, it would be the vernacular and whatever, So, we allow them to recognize language in context and use it appropriately.
And you can watch the full interviews of Ambassadors Andrea Bowman and Robert Kennedy Lewis on the TaiwanPlus app and website and the connected YouTube channel. Now, Christopher, you were here in Taiwan. You spent time as a visiting scholar at the Institute of Linguistics at Academia Sinica. And from your experience here, what do you think Taiwan can learn from other countries, particularly as we've seen there in the Caribbean, in trying to revive its lesser spoken languages?
As I see it, and doing a bit of background reading about this as well, the question of status is vital to this whole process, because you've got already a high status language, Mandarin, the indigenous languages because of the history and also just because of the sheer numbers who speak it, have a lower status. So that focus on improving the status is important, but also I guess just embracing one's heritage is is an important thing, and valuing that not only within the communities but also within society more generally is important. I talked earlier about signs when I'm in Tainan, which is the center of the Siraya language area, if you like. There are very few signs in Siraya, and if people see their own language around them, I think that would greatly benefit their sense of, it's worth learning, it's worth investing time in. I think those are some of the lessons that can be learned from the Creole experience.
Now, you've somewhat answered this, but many would ask, why bother learning these other languages or keeping these other languages in the mainstream or even being part of society when, really speaking, practically speaking, you only need a handful of languages in the world to get a good job or to be able to communicate or travel?
That is a very good question indeed. Why bother? We only have a limited amount of time, so you might think, well, I need to focus on the languages that will get me further in life, if you like, than any other languages. One reason is, of course, about identity. And I was struck a few years ago when I encountered someone who's ethnically Siraya in Tainan, and I said, "Can you speak any of this language?" And she said, "No." This was in Chinese, but she said no, and I was so taken that you've lost your language. So why bother? I guess there's a sense of rectification that has to be at work here, to say, well, these languages have declined, not through any great fault of the indigenous people, but because of the advance of other cultures, particularly Han Chinese cultures. So it's just bringing things back to equilibrium that would be a result of people learning the languages. But as you say, it takes time, and people have to have the desire to do it. So it needs champions. There need to be champions high up in government. Wouldn't it be wonderful, for example, if the president of Taiwan opened one of his speeches not in Mandarin, but in an indigenous language?
But the question, Christopher, would be which indigenous language, as Taiwan has a number of those?
Indeed, it does. And I think there you make a very good point, because if the president were to speak in one language, then the speakers of other languages may feel left out. So I think, it would be a good symbol to speak an indigenous language, but the question remains which one.
Now, Christopher, as mentioned, few know that Taiwan has its own Creole. It's regarded as one of the most unique in the world, as it's the only Japanese-based Creole. Connected Siobhan Powell visited the birthplace of Taiwan's only Creole with Professor Chien Yuehchen, who 2 decades ago started documenting the language and interacting with the communities who speak it.
Listen closely. They speak a language that may soon fade into silence forever. For decades, the words they speak didn't even have any linguistic identity until this professor from National Aohua University in eastern Taiwan defined and documented it. Chien Yuehchen, along with a doctoral advisor from Osaka University, Sanada Shinji, also gave this unique language a name.
在学界，我们称为宜兰克里奥尔。我用英语的话是 Yilan Creole.
Named after its birthplace of Yilan, this is the only Creole spoken in Taiwan.
我和我的指导教授从2005年、2006年就开始进行这个田野调查。那在调查过程当中，经过日治时期的文献的爬梳，然后还有田野调查的访谈，我们很确定它是一个全新的语言。
Yilan Creole took root under Japan's occupation between 1895 and 1945, when 2 of Taiwan's indigenous groups, the Taiyan and Sejik, came in contact with each other They wove their native dialects with the compulsory Japanese of the time to create the language.
一个语言有了母语使用者的存在，所以呢，这个语言就越趋稳定。我们推论，在1930年代，日语加了泰雅语还有赛德克语成分的这一个接触语言，它因为有 native speaker 的产生，所以呢，也克里奥尔化，成为一个稳定的语言。
There are around 100 Creole languages worldwide, but Yilan Creole is spoken in just 4 villages: Aohua, Tungyueh, Hansi, and Chien.
我们今天要去部落，那今天要去2个部落，一个是阿花部落，然后中午过后要去东岳部落。
She has been visiting Aohua, engaging with the Yilan Creole speakers.
因为我们的话都跟别村的没有一样啊，
同是一样的
语言腔调也的不一样、啊，
而且腔调不一样。我们讲我们澳花的话，可是南澳、东澳都不一样，那个腔调不一样。
They have tried to instill the importance of preserving the language to their children.
可是我们在山上可能就是亚芒那嘎多过来耶内。一连串的字句就是米纳诺过来尤布诺过来。这个语言是真的可以代表你是这个部落的人，它是一个很重要的，因为你不讲澳花的语言，并不代表你不是澳花的人。可是当你碰到澳花的人，你不会讲澳花的话的时候，在外面人家会认为你是澳花的吗？
其实刚开始没有在学的感觉，就是听他们讲，然后可能也是到大学以后才是。本来都不讲，但是就听，然后到大学以后跟老师做以后，然后跟老师学习，就会开始要练习去记录，然后就开始会变得好像一定要讲。然后后来这2年发现，一定要讲澳话的话，妈妈他们才会比较注意你在讲什么，不然平常不会理你。
These senior citizens at Aohua's Indigenous Culture and Health Center are some of the remaining fluent speakers of the Creole language.
像如果说我们40岁以上的都有讲我们克里奥的语言，但是在40岁以下的几乎好像比较少。那岁数越小的话，越就不会讲。
我们现在从澳花要前往东澳，现在正在苏花公路路上。
Chien says their voices are a living archive as the young in Tungyueh shy away from speaking the Creole.
可是我们听不太懂，对，那当然就是那种嘲笑式的啊，因为原住民很直嘛，就是你会感受到他一定是贬义的那种，你就知道说他可能是在笑你或者是在骂你，这样类似这样子的。
我在学校不敢讲我们的话，因为没有人会听得懂，没有人听得懂，所以我在部落会讲，可是到学校我就不会讲，因为我就听他们正统的泰雅语，这样子。
Chien's fear is real. She estimates there are fewer than 1,000 fluent speakers of Yilan Creole at present. While the elderly people are still using the language in their daily lives, it's almost like a foreign language to most of the younger generation.
弟弟见我家邻个这个几岁？
对，啊，不会。
哦。
世界母语日前夕，宜兰韩西部落族人来到。
Yet there's a spark of hope.
2023年2月18，也就是在世界母语日的前夕，以韩西部落为主的这个族人到立法院进行陈情，希望政府能够正视宜兰克里奥尔的独特性，将宜兰克里奥尔认定为国家语言。
While Yilan Creole is slowly dying, these proficient speakers are the professor's most valuable resources. They're the living archives of the world's only known Japanese-based Creole.
Christopher, did you know that Taiwan had a Creole?
I did, actually, yes. It's been written about a fair bit because of its unique status. Just to develop that idea, it's, as you said, it's a Japanese-based Creole, I think with Atayal as the indigenous language. And I went to a church service in Amis a few years ago, and I was struck by the amount of Japanese words that were being used by the speaker of Amis. So Japanese, because of the colonial period here, has influenced the indigenous languages a fair bit, including the emergence of this Yilan Creole.
Now, as a linguistic scholar who has had experience in Taiwan and has looked at it from the outside, what would you say Taiwan needs to do finally to make its revitalizing of languages more robust?
Well, I think, again, it comes to two things. Firstly, that question of status, and to, put indigenous languages on a level playing field. In so many words, some sort of policy, either official or unofficial, where you have what's called diglossia would be helpful. You do need a language of wider communication for a society to function properly, and Mandarin, possibly alongside English, would take that role. But then you can also have other languages that people use, if you like, in everyday life, in the home, at schools, in the shops, and space for Taiwanese people to have that second language, or even a third language, would really be an important step forward in that regard. So here's hoping, and maybe we'll come back in a few years and see how things are going. But perhaps one final point is, it's a slow process. It doesn't change overnight, and it really does need champions, including people high up in government, to validate the indigenous languages, so that the parents think, yeah, it's okay to talk this, and there will be some value to it, to the child and to society more generally.
And with that, we'll have to leave it there. Great to have you on the program. Thank you so much, Christopher Joby, a professor at the Center of Taiwan Studies at SOAS University of London. And for our viewers everywhere, it has been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.